I knew something was terribly wrong the moment I heard my name spoken from the hallway. Not loud, not rushed, but calm and confident, like whoever said it wasn't afraid of being heard and had already thought this through. I stopped moving completely, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as I held my breath, because her voice carried through the wall in a way that made my stomach tighten, controlled and careful. Nothing like how a child normally speaks. She said, "Make him drink. Then no one will ask questions. It'll look accidental." And in that instant, the air felt heavy, like the house itself was listening. For a few seconds, my mind tried to protect me by lying, telling me I must have misunderstood, that she couldn't possibly be talking about something so serious, so dark. But then another voice answered her, an adult voice, steady and low. And that was the moment fear stopped being a feeling and turned into certainty. Because in this house, there was only one man she could be talking about, my husband. I didn't turn around or confront anyone, because some instincts are louder than reason, and everything inside me said that silence was safer than truth in that moment. So I forced a smile, picked up my glass, walked back into the room, and handed it to my husband, knowing that one wrong decision could have changed our lives forever. I met Gideon at a charity event, the kind that feels harmless and predictable, where people dress well, smile politely, and nothing bad ever seems possible. He wasn't flashy or overly charming, but when he listened, it felt genuine, like he wasn't just waiting for his turn to talk. And after my own broken engagement, that kind of attention felt rare. At that stage of my life, I wasn't looking for excitement or passion. I was looking for something stable, something that didn't make my chest tighten with anxiety. Gideon carried himself like a man who had already survived chaos and had no desire to return to it, and that quiet certainty made me feel safe. He told me about his first marriage early on, how it had been emotional, loud, and exhausting, and how he'd promised himself never to live like that again. Rowena, his ex-wife, was still very much part of his life because of their daughter Tamsin, who moved between two homes every week like she belonged to both and neither. I understood that marrying Gideon meant stepping into something unfinished, but I believed patience and love could soften whatever sharp edges remained. When he proposed, he didn't promise fireworks or passion, he promised peace, and at the time, that sounded better than anything else. Moving in together wasn't dramatic or romantic, it was practical, boxes, schedules, shared responsibilities, and the slow merging of two routines. Tamsin was distant from the beginning, not openly rude, just quiet and observant, like she was studying me rather than welcoming me. I kept reminding myself that I wasn't there to replace her mother, only to support her father and exist respectfully in her space. Rowena, however, never missed a chance to make her presence felt, calling Gideon over small issues that somehow always turned into criticism. She smiled when she spoke to me, but her words were sharp, carefully chosen to remind me that I was temporary in her story. Over time, our house settled into a rhythm of shared dinners and quiet evenings, and I allowed myself to believe we were slowly becoming a family. But a few months ago, something shifted, not suddenly but quietly, like a pressure change you feel before a storm arrives. Tamsin stopped talking unless necessary, yet she watched everything closely. Who poured the drinks, who touched what, who sat where. Gideon brushed it off as teenage mood swings, and I wanted to believe him because believing felt easier than questioning everything. The night I heard her whisper in the hallway, all those small moments rearranged themselves into something that finally made sense. At dinner, Gideon laughed and lifted the glass I had handed him, completely unaware of the fear tightening in my chest. Tamsin watched him drink, not with concern or affection, but with expectation, like she was waiting for a result. I told myself I was imagining it, because accepting the truth meant admitting that my home might not be safe anymore. Later that night, lying beside Gideon and listening to his steady breathing, I realized that peace can sometimes look exactly like safety right before it disappears. And for the first time since marrying him, I wondered whether loving him would be enough to protect him from what was coming. The next morning, I woke up before Gideon, my body tense in a way sleep hadn't fixed, and I lay there watching the ceiling while his breathing filled the room, steady and trusting, the kind of breathing you only have when you believe you're safe. And I hated that I was counting it like something fragile. When I finally got out of bed, I moved through the house quietly, every small sound feeling louder than it should have, the floorboards, the kettle, even my own footsteps, as if the house itself was aware that something dangerous had already been spoken inside it. The wine bottle from the night before was still sitting on the counter, half full, ordinary and innocent, and I stared at it longer than made sense, thinking about how normal objects become weapons when intention changes, and how no one ever suspects what looks familiar. Tamsin came down for breakfast without looking at me, scrolling on her phone like any other teenager, relaxed, unbothered, and for a few seconds I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything, that fear had twisted something harmless into something dark. Then she looked up and asked, "Dad okay today?" in a tone so casual it felt practiced, and that single sentence wiped away all my doubt, because concern doesn't sound like that, and guilt doesn't hide so comfortably behind indifference. I answered her calmly, forcing my voice to stay neutral, watching her reaction more than listening to my own words. And when she shrugged and went back to her screen, I understood that she wasn't asking for reassurance. She was checking a condition. After she left for school and the door closed behind her, the silence felt heavier than before, like the house was finally honest with me. And that was when I crossed a line I never thought I would cross in my marriage. I went into Gideon's office, not because I wanted to invade his privacy, but because something inside me already knew that the truth wouldn't come gently, and waiting any longer felt more dangerous than knowing. The room looked exactly the way it always did, neat, controlled, organized, a reflection of the man himself. And for a moment I almost walked out, embarrassed by my own suspicion, until I opened a drawer and found an envelope that didn't belong there. It was thick, unmarked, carefully folded, and the moment I touched it, my hands started shaking, because instinct doesn't ask for permission. It only reacts when something feels wrong. Inside were printed screenshots of text messages, not emotional ones, not angry ones, but calm, methodical messages between Rowena and someone saved as K, written like instructions instead of conversations. They talked about timing, about appearances, about how things would look to doctors, schools, and courts, and with every line I read, my chest tightened as the picture became impossible to ignore. One message said they needed Gideon to look unstable or unwell, not permanently, just enough to force change, and that was when I finally understood what kind of game this was. The last message made me sit down hard in Gideon's chair, because it erased any remaining doubt, talking about small doses, not enough to kill, just enough to scare, just enough to build a believable story. It wasn't about ending his life, it was about controlling it, rewriting it, and taking pieces of it away legally, slowly, and without leaving fingerprints. Everything suddenly made sense. The constant calls, the complaints masked as concern, the way Rowena framed every argument like she was protecting Tamsin instead of attacking Gideon. And Tamsin, living in both houses, listening to both sides, wasn't just caught in the middle. She was becoming part of the environment that made this possible. I took photos of every page, my movements calm despite my racing heart, because survival has a way of turning fear into focus, and then I put everything back exactly where it had been. That evening, Gideon came home exhausted, talking about work and stress, mentioning another call from Rowena, completely unaware that his life was being discussed in terms of dosage and timing. At dinner, Tamsin watched our glasses more than our faces, and when she offered to pour, I stopped her without thinking, the brief change in her eyes telling me she noticed far more than she let on. Later, standing alone in the kitchen, staring at the clean glasses lined up in the cabinet, I realized the most terrifying part of all of this wasn't poison or planning. It was trust. Because the person who trusted everyone the most was the one standing closest to the danger. And as I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I knew this wasn't something I could expose too early or handle carelessly. This wasn't just about protecting my husband anymore. It was about staying one step ahead of a plan that was already in motion, quiet, patient, and hiding in plain sight. By the time the truth finally broke the surface, I had already learned how to live with fear quietly, how to smile through dinner, how to watch every glass, every plate, every small habit that could be turned against Gideon without him ever noticing. I stopped confronting things directly and started paying attention instead, because I understood that whatever was happening relied on me reacting emotionally, panicking too early, or exposing myself before I understood the full shape of the trap being built around us. Gideon, meanwhile, started feeling off. Nothing dramatic at first, just headaches, nausea, moments of dizziness that came and went. The kind of symptoms doctors dismiss easily and people explain away as stress. Rowena noticed immediately, of course, or at least pretended to, calling Gideon with concern wrapped tightly around accusation, suggesting doctors, hinting that maybe he was overworked, maybe overwhelmed, maybe not as stable as he thought. Tamsin watched all of this unfold with a calm that didn't belong to a teenager, her eyes sharper now, more confident, like she was seeing pieces fall into place exactly the way someone had promised her they would. The first time Gideon got sick after dinner, he laughed it off, blaming the food, blaming himself, apologizing to me for being dramatic, and I stood there holding his hand, nodding while something cold settled deeper into my chest. That night, while he slept restlessly beside me, I realized I couldn't keep waiting for proof to come to me, because the proof was already living in our house, speaking to me in careful sentences and watching my reactions too closely. The breaking point came on a quiet evening when Gideon came home exhausted and poured himself a drink without asking, trusting the space he had built, trusting the people around him in a way that suddenly felt dangerous. Tamsin was already in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone, and when she saw the glass in his hand, she looked up just long enough for me to catch the anticipation in her eyes. "Dad, you should drink it all," she said lightly, like a joke, like encouragement. But her voice tightened at the edges and Gideon laughed without noticing the shift. I felt something inside me snap then, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because I knew that if I stayed silent any longer, I wouldn't be protecting him. I'd be helping them. I asked Gideon to sit down, my voice steadier than I felt, and when he looked at me confused, I realized how deeply unprepared he was for the truth that had been circling him for weeks. Tamsin froze, just slightly, the way people do when they sense a moment slipping out of their control, and that tiny pause told me more than any confession ever could. I told Gideon about the hallway, about the whisper, about the words I couldn't forget, and as I spoke, I watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief, then to something close to fear. He laughed once, sharply, not because it was funny, but because the idea felt too wrong to accept, and he asked me why I hadn't said something sooner. I told him the truth, that I was scared, that I didn't know who was involved, that I didn't know how deep it went, and that sometimes silence feels safer until you realize it's already killing you. That was when Tamsin finally spoke, her voice controlled but strained, telling us we were overreacting, telling us her mother was just worried, telling us we were imagining things because we wanted a villain. I asked her why she had been watching the glasses, why she kept checking if Gideon felt okay, why she used words like accidental instead of mistake, and the room went painfully quiet. For a long moment, she didn't answer, and in that silence, Gideon saw his daughter differently for the first time, not as a child needing protection, but as someone holding information she didn't want to share. When she finally spoke, her words weren't angry. They were defensive, rehearsed, like something she'd been told enough times to believe it herself, and that realization hurt Gideon more than any accusation could have. He asked her directly if her mother had told her to do anything, and she shook her head too quickly, then stopped, realizing that even denial can sound like confession when it comes too fast. The argument that followed wasn't loud. It was fractured, broken by pauses and unfinished sentences, by Gideon trying to understand how his own child could be standing on the edge of something so dangerous. I told Gideon about the envelope, the messages, the words, small doses, and I watched the color drain from his face as the pieces finally locked together. He didn't shout, he didn't rage, he just sat there staring at the table, realizing that the life he trusted had been quietly reshaped without his consent. Rowena arrived later that night after Gideon called her, confident at first, calm, almost smug, until Gideon repeated her own words back to her, word for word. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't have an immediate response, and that hesitation spoke louder than any denial she could have offered. She tried to shift the narrative, to frame everything as concern, misunderstanding, coincidence. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she'd underestimated one thing. Because I wasn't emotional, I wasn't shouting, and I wasn't guessing anymore. I was reciting facts, patterns, timelines, and intentions she hadn't expected me to piece together. The night ended without closure, without apologies, without peace, but with something far more important, awareness. And as Gideon sat beside me afterward, silent and shaken, I knew the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that the people closest to him had almost convinced him his own body, his own reality, couldn't be trusted. And that was a kind of damage that didn't disappear easily. The days after that confrontation moved strangely, like time had slowed but refused to stop completely, and the house that once felt calm now carried the weight of everything that had been said and everything that still hadn't been forgiven. Gideon didn't speak much at first, not because he didn't have questions, but because the answers had shaken something deep inside him, something about trust, about fatherhood, about how easily love can be used as leverage. He kept replaying moments from the past in his head, conversations with Rowena that now sounded different, memories with Tamsin that suddenly felt altered, and I could see the quiet grief settling into him as he realized how close he'd come to doubting his own sanity. Rowena tried to reach out again, her messages carefully worded, apologetic without admitting guilt, still framing everything as concern, but Gideon stopped responding, not out of anger, but because he finally understood that engagement was exactly what she wanted. Tamsin stayed with her mother after that, not as a punishment, but as a boundary. And that choice alone said more than any argument ever could, because Gideon needed distance to see clearly, and she needed space to sit with what she had almost helped create. I won't pretend it was easy for him, because it wasn't. Losing daily contact with his daughter felt like another kind of injury, one that didn't bleed but ached constantly, and some nights I heard him crying quietly when he thought I was asleep. What surprised me most wasn't the sadness. It was the clarity that followed it, the way Gideon slowly stopped apologizing for things that were never his fault, the way he began trusting his instincts again instead of dismissing them. Doctors confirmed what we already suspected, that the symptoms he'd been experiencing weren't random, that something had been affecting him in small amounts, and hearing that out loud was both validating and terrifying. There were legal steps after that, careful ones, guided by evidence instead of emotion, and for the first time, Rowena's confidence cracked because facts don't bend the way narratives do. Through all of it, I stayed steady, not because I wasn't afraid anymore, but because fear had already taught me what hesitation could cost, and I wasn't willing to learn that lesson twice. Gideon told me one night, weeks later, that the hardest part wasn't almost getting sick. It was realizing how easily trust can be weaponized when people know your routines, your kindness, your belief in family. He said he kept thinking about the glass, about how many times he'd accepted something without question, simply because it was offered by someone he loved, and that thought alone changed him more than anything else. Our marriage didn't come out of this untouched, but it came out honest, stripped of illusions, built now on awareness instead of assumption, and strangely, that made it stronger than it had ever been before. I learned something too, something uncomfortable but necessary, that silence doesn't always protect peace, and that waiting to act can sometimes be just as dangerous as acting without thought. When I look back at that moment in the kitchen, the whisper in the hallway, The decision to hand over my glass. I don't see fear anymore. I see the moment everything changed. Because sometimes survival doesn't look like running or screaming. Sometimes it looks like staying calm long enough to understand the danger and brave enough to face it when the time is right. Tani. And if this story taught me anything, it's that real danger often hides behind familiar faces, quiet voices, and the assumption that family would never mean harm. If this story hit hard, like, share, and subscribe for more real confessions and unforgettable moments.